Hey there, students. Welcome to my first video lecture. A couple things before we get started. First, please remember to take notes throughout the lecture. Obviously, you're going to want to fill in any blanks with the correct word or phrase, but also feel free to take notes in the margins at will. Second, please remember that this is a video, so you can stop, you can pause, you can rewind, you can rewatch whenever you want, both now and as you begin to study for your tests. And third, please remember that there's a quiz on Edmodo at the end of the lecture so that I can get a baseline for what you understood and so that you can ask any questions that we can go over in class for discussion. All right, so let's get started. I hope you have your notes out and we'll get ready to begin. We're beginning Chapter 1, Classifying and Exploring Life. We will complete all 3 sections listed here, and I've got some super cool in-class activities to enhance your learning as we go along. Today's lecture covers Section 1.1, Characteristics of Life. So as you already know, in this section we are going to investigate one of the fundamental questions in all of biology, which is, how do we distinguish or tell the difference between living and non-living things? We know that art and pop culture have explored this idea, as evidenced from our film clips, from Frankenstein, and from Terminator 2, and from Big Hero 6. But how do scientists know when to call something living? In this section, we will focus on identifying and exploring the 6 characteristics that all living things share in common. Of course, the reason that this is important is that this year our course of study is biology, and that is, by definition, the study of life. If we are going to study life, we must first know how to tell the difference between things that are living and things that are not living. So, let's begin by taking a look at some of the pictures here. We've got some non-living things like the train, the lava lamp, and the robot here, as well as some living plants and animals. So, what makes the plants and animals on this side living, while the other things are non-living? The answer is that only living things can claim all 6 of the following characteristics. 1. Living things are organized. 2. Living things grow and develop. 3. Living things reproduce. 4. Living things respond to stimuli. 5. Living things maintain homeostasis. And 6. Living things use energy. Now, I know that some of these terms and concepts are unfamiliar to you, so I will discuss each one in detail on a separate slide. It is important to understand also that non-living things might exhibit some of these characteristics. For example, the old train here is using energy released from coal. The shape of the lava inside the lava lamp grows and changes over time. And the robot here is certainly organized. However, only living things have all 6 of the characteristics, earning them the title of organisms. So that is our first vocabulary word, organism. It refers to anything that exhibits all 6 characteristics of life. So let's begin to elaborate on each of the 6 characteristics so that we really understand their meaning. We will begin with characteristic 1, which is that living things are organized. Think for a moment about what the word organized means to you. How might you define it? I'll pause for a second to let you think about it. So, when I was writing this slide, I actually had a difficult time defining it on my own. Like most people, I kind of have this, well, I just know it when I see it sort of feeling. So I looked it up in a dictionary and pieced together a definition for you. Here's what I came up with. To be organized means to be arranged in a logical way with specific structures that have specific functions. When examining organisms, one of the most absolutely fascinating things that scientists find is that they are exquisitely and logically organized from small, microscopic, basic units called cells. Now, some organisms have what we call a unicellular organization, and some have a multicellular organization. And we are going to compare these two types of organizations in the chart below. To be unicellular means to be an organism that is made of only one cell. So, if you have just one cell, how can you qualify as organized? Well, and yes, you may need to pause the video here to write this out. I know it's sort of long, but it's important. A single cell has many internal structures, and these structures are arranged to work together. Some structures inside the cell store food, while others make energy, while others build new materials, and so on. You can see some example here of what this looks like. We've got an amoeba, a paramecium, and a euglena. There are specific structures within each of these examples that are responsible for specific jobs. So let's compare that to the organization of multicellular organisms. When we talk about multicellular organisms, we are talking about organisms that are made of many cells. Okay, here's your long sentence again. What this organization means in a multicellular organism is that the multiple cells, sometimes in the trillions even, are arranged into groups that can do different jobs. For example, some cells might be arranged into eyes or leaves for capturing light. Other cells might be arranged into a digestive system for breaking down food, and so on. Animals, plants, and many fungi are multicellular. Okay, the second characteristic of living things is that they grow and develop. Now, we must distinguish between the two words grow and develop, because although they're often used together, they do not actually mean the same thing. To grow is to increase in size. For our unicellular organisms, this simply means that the organism's one cell expands. But for a multicellular organism to grow, it actually has to increase the total number of cells that it has. In contrast, to develop means to change over time, which is more than just an increase in size. You can see from the pictures here how the jellyfish and the plant and the salmon change their forms and structures throughout their lives. As they change form and structure, we call this development. I want you to pause now and think of some other examples of development that you've seen or studied, and be ready to share in class tomorrow. The third characteristic of living things is that living things reproduce. Now, I can already feel you giggling because we're talking about reproduction so early in the year. When you're all done giggling, I want you to think very basically about what the word reproduce means. For example, if I were to ask you to reproduce a skit you performed yesterday, or reproduce your notes, what would I be asking you? I'd be asking you to provide a new version or a new copy. So, in biology, the meaning is similar. To reproduce refers to any process by which an organism makes one or more new organisms. Now, It is true that some individuals within a population might not reproduce. However, within the entire population, other members must reproduce in order for the species itself to survive. It is also important to remember that although not all organisms reproduce, to remember that although all organisms reproduce, they do not all reproduce in the same way. Some species of organisms require mates, while others do not. Some species of organisms have specialized cells for reproduction. In some species, hundreds of offspring might be reproduced. Like here in our picture of this kalanchoe plant, along the edges there are hundreds of baby kalanchoe plant offsprings. In other cases, some species may produce only one or two offspring, like our mama polar bear here on the right. The fourth characteristic of living things is that they respond to stimuli. Let's begin by defining the word stimulus as an action or event that causes an organism to do something, or in other words, to respond. We should also recognize that stimuli can be external, that is, originating from the outside environment of the organism, or internal, which is originating from within the organism itself. I've got a couple examples shown below, so let's see if we can identify the stimulus and the response in each. In the left picture, the action or event, that is, the stimulus, is the pinch provided by the crab. This stimulus causes the organism, which is in this case the human, to respond by flinching and shouting, "Ouch!" Let's look at a second example. In the right picture, the plant in the fallen pot has changed its direction of growth in response to the stimulus of the light above it. Okay, so in this case, the stimulus is the light, and the response is the change in direction of growth. Now look at the picture in the middle. On your own, I'd like for you to identify the stimulus and response demonstrated in the picture, and we'll go over your ideas in class. The fifth characteristic of living things is that they maintain homeostasis. Now, that's a new and very sciencey word for you, so let's start by defining it. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain steady internal conditions, even when outside conditions change. As you learned last year, the Earth is a dynamic place, and the environments that organisms live in are constantly changing. Temperature, rainfall, nutrient ability, and many other factors vary day to day, even minute by minute. So, what are some internal factors that organisms might want to control or keep in steady balance, even as outside factors are changing? Well, temperature, to begin with. We don't want our internal temperature getting too high or too low. We want it to stay within an optimal range. The same is true with the amount of water in our bodies, as well as the amount of salt and the amount of nutrients. In addition, organisms that breathe oxygen and exchange it for carbon dioxide need to regulate how much of these gases they have, along with their heart rates and blood pressures, which help deliver those gases. So, there are also many, many more things that we could list, but we've got a good start. Now, what happens when one of these conditions becomes unbalanced? The organism's body will begin a homeostatic response to return it to the stable condition it started at. We'll look at one specific factor, temperature, to see how homeostasis works, and then we'll explore more examples tomorrow during class. All right, let's begin by establishing that humans have an ideal internal temperature range between 35 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. If the temperature starts to fall below this range, the organism will initiate a response to bring the temperature back up into the stable range. In this case, the response is shivering. The opposite can happen as well. If the organism's temperature gets too high, a different homeostatic response, sweating, can bring it back down into a stable range. So, even though outside conditions are changing, the organism is able to control its own inside environment. I've got a great brain pop on this that I'll need you to remind me to play for you tomorrow as class starts. Finally, the sixth and last characteristic of living things is that they must use energy to stay alive. One of the very cool facts about our world is that all of the energy that every organism on Earth uses to power its life can all be traced back to a single, irreplaceable source, our star, the sun. That means that the existence of life on Earth is completely dependent on the sun. And without access to sunlight, it's unlikely that any sort of life could ever have evolved on Earth. So, how do organisms use energy from the sun? Some organisms, such as plants, obtain this energy directly through the process of photosynthesis. Other organisms, such as animals, must obtain the energy indirectly by consuming other organisms that would have the sun's energy stored in them in the form of chemical bonds. As this food web here shows, energy that starts in the sun can be transferred from organism to organism in the form of chemical food. All right, kiddos, that's all for tonight. We will continue in class tomorrow with some practice. Make sure you take and complete the quick quiz on Edmodo and write down any questions you have for class tomorrow. See you then.